Sometimes your child doesn't slam a door in your face. Sometimes they do something worse. They quietly erase you from their life like you never mattered at all. I was standing in my kitchen the day my son blocked my number. The chicken soup I'd been making for almost 3 hours still simmered on the stove, filling the house with the same smell Daniel used to run home for after Little League practice. Outside my window, the October rain tapped softly against the glass, and for one foolish moment, I thought maybe he'd finally called me back because he was busy, because he was tired, because families go through phases. That's what I kept telling myself anyway. My phone rang once before the call connected, and I felt immediate relief rush through my chest. "Danny, sweetheart, I just wanted to make sure Mason's cough was getting better," I said gently, holding the phone with both hands like it was something fragile. There was silence on the other end for a second. Then my son sighed heavily, the way people do when they're already irritated before you've even spoken. "Mom," he said flatly, "Ashley and I need space." I blinked confused. "Space? Honey, I haven't talked to you in almost 3 weeks." Another silence. Then I heard her voice faintly in the background. "Ashley, just say it, Daniel." My stomach tightened instantly. Over the past few years I had learned to recognize that tone. Calm, cold, controlled. The kind of voice that smiled at church picnics while quietly cutting you out of family photos. Daniel cleared his throat. "Stop calling us, Mom." I honestly thought I'd heard him wrong. "What?" I whispered. "You keep making everything stressful," he continued. "We're trying to focus on our family right now. Our family." As if I had somehow become separate from it. As if the woman who worked double shifts for 15 years to keep the lights on while raising him alone was now some unwanted stranger interrupting their peace. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say another word, the line went dead. At first I thought the call had dropped. Then I tried calling back. One ring. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Again. Blocked. I stood there, frozen in my quiet Ohio kitchen while the soup slowly burned on the stove behind me. And for the first time in my 67 years, I realized something heartbreaking. My son hadn't just stopped loving me. Someone had taught him that I was disposable. The next morning, I woke up hoping the entire thing had been some terrible misunderstanding. That is the strange thing about being a mother. Even after someone breaks your heart, part of you still searches for excuses to protect them. I sat at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands while staring at my phone like it might suddenly light up with Daniel's name. An apology. A simple message. Anything. But the screen stayed dark. Around 10 that morning I opened Facebook and immediately wished I had not. The first thing I saw was a photo Ashley had posted less than an hour earlier. Daniel was standing beside her in their backyard holding Mason on his shoulders while little Emma grinned beside them with frosting all over her cheeks. Balloons filled the patio. There was a giant birthday cake covered in blue icing. Perfect family weekend. Ashley had written with a heart emoji underneath. I felt my chest tighten so suddenly that I had to set my coffee down before I dropped the mug. Mason's birthday party had been yesterday. Nobody told me. Nobody invited me. I zoomed in on the picture without even realizing I was doing it. There were at least 15 people there. Ashley's parents, her sister and brother-in-law, neighbors, friends from church. Even Daniel's old college roommate was standing near the grill laughing with him. But there was no place for me anywhere in that backyard. I sat there staring at those photos for almost 20 minutes, feeling something much worse than anger settle into my stomach. It was humiliation. Quiet humiliation. The kind that makes you question whether people have been tolerating you instead of loving you for years. I remembered every birthday party I had ever thrown for Daniel growing up. Every homemade cake shaped like dinosaurs or baseball gloves. Every Christmas morning where I stayed up until 2 in the morning wrapping presents after finishing late. Shifts at the nursing home. There were years I skipped buying winter coats for myself so Daniel could have the expensive sneakers all the other boys wore at school. And now somehow I had become the outsider looking in through a screen. Around noon, my sister Carol called after seeing Ashley's photos online. "Margaret," she said carefully, "did you know about the party?" I forced a laugh that did not sound real even to me. "Oh yes," I lied softly. "They probably just wanted to keep it small." There was silence on the line for a moment before Carol quietly answered, "Honey, there were at least 30 people there." After we hung up, I walked into the living room and noticed the birthday gifts I had already bought for Mason sitting untouched beside my fireplace. A brand new train set. 2 books about space because he wanted to be an astronaut someday. I stared at those wrapped presents for a long time before finally realizing something painful. My son had not only blocked my number, he had started erasing me from his children's memories too. For the next few days, I moved through my house like someone learning how to live inside silence again. I stopped reaching for my phone every few minutes because deep down I already knew there would be nothing waiting for me. No messages. No photos of the kids. No accidental calls. Nothing. The hardest part was not the anger. It was the emptiness. Mothers spend decades building their lives around other people. And one day you wake up realizing nobody prepared you for what happens when those people decide they no longer need you. On Thursday afternoon, I drove to the grocery store just to get out of the house. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes and a silver nose ring, smiled politely while scanning my items. "Any fun plans this weekend?" she asked casually. I almost answered. I was supposed to see my grandchildren, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "Nothing too exciting." That night I found myself wandering into Daniel's old bedroom upstairs. I had not touched much in there over the years. His baseball trophies still sat on the shelf beside faded high school photos. There was an old University of Michigan pennant hanging crooked above the bed, and tucked inside the closet was the winter coat he wore senior year. I ran my fingers across the sleeves slowly, remembering all the overtime shifts it took for me to afford that coat. Daniel was 16 then, too embarrassed to admit the other boys teased him for wearing second-hand clothes. So I picked up extra weekend shifts at the nursing home until I could buy him the expensive brand everybody else had. I remember how tightly he hugged me Christmas morning after opening it. "One day I am going to take care of you the way you take care of me," he promised back then. I sat on the edge of his bed holding that old coat in my lap while tears rolled silently down my face. The painful truth was not that my son had changed overnight. The truth was that this distancing had started years ago, little by little, after Ashley came into his life. At first, I blamed myself for noticing it. Every time she made a small comment, I told myself I was being sensitive. "Daniel is very busy now," she would say whenever I called. "We are trying to create healthy boundaries." Boundaries. That word became her favorite weapon. She said it with a smile so polite it almost made you feel guilty for being hurt. Looking back, I realized something unsettling. Ashley never directly fought with me. She did something far more effective. She slowly convinced Daniel that loving his mother too much somehow made him a bad husband. And over time, my son stopped sounding like the boy I raised and started sounding exactly like her. About 2 weeks after Daniel blocked my number, I saw Ashley for the first time since the phone call. I had gone to Millbrook Market on a Saturday morning because they always stocked fresh apple cider around that time of year. The air outside smelled like cinnamon and wet leaves, and families crowded the sidewalks carrying pumpkins and paper coffee cups. I remember thinking how strange it was that the whole world kept moving normally, while my own life felt cracked straight down the middle. I was standing near the produce section comparing 2 bags of apples when I heard Mason laughing somewhere behind me. My heart reacted before my mind did. I turned instantly and saw them near the bakery counter. Daniel was not there. Just Ashley with the children. Emma sat inside the shopping cart wearing a tiny pink jacket, while Mason begged for one of the oversized frosted cookies the store sold every fall. The sight of them hit me so hard I almost forgot how to breathe. For a second, instinct took over. I started walking toward them with a smile already forming on my face. "Mason," I called warmly. "Sweetheart, Grandma is here." My grandson turned immediately, his eyes lighting up with recognition. "Grandma Maggie," he shouted excitedly, jumping down from beside the cart. But before he could run to me, Ashley reached out calmly and placed her hand on his shoulder. It looked gentle to anyone watching, protective even. But I noticed the way her expression changed the second she saw me. Not surprise. Not embarrassment. Annoyance. Like I had interrupted something important simply by existing in the same grocery store. "Mason," she said softly, "stay with Mommy." He looked confused. "But Grandma is here." Ashley finally looked at me directly, offering one of those polished suburban smiles that never reached her eyes. "Hello, Margaret," she said. "Not Mom," Not Margaret with warmth. Just cold politeness wrapped in good manners. "Hi, Ashley," I answered carefully. "I was just hoping to say hello to the kids." Before she could respond, little Emma waved excitedly from the cart. "Grandma," she squealed. The sound nearly broke me. Ashley adjusted Emma's blanket without acknowledging it. "We are actually in a hurry today," she said smoothly. "The children already have a very full schedule." I glanced down at Mason, who was still staring at me like he wanted permission to come closer. I could see the confusion in his little face. Children notice tension long before adults think they do. "I bought birthday gifts for you," I told him gently. "They are still at Grandma's house." Ashley's smile tightened just slightly. "That is not necessary," she replied before Mason could answer. Then, without another word, she turned the cart and walked away with my grandchildren while I stood there holding a bag of apples against my chest like an idiot. But the moment that haunted me most was not Ashley walking away. It was the way Mason kept looking back at me over his shoulder until they disappeared around the corner. After the grocery store incident, something inside me finally started to shift. Not all at once. Pain like that does not disappear overnight. But little cracks had started forming in the version of myself that spent years begging quietly for scraps of attention from people who should have loved me freely. The following Sunday, I sat alone in church for the first time in months without constantly checking my phone afterward to see if Daniel had texted. Usually I rushed home hoping there would be a message waiting. Maybe a photo of the children. Maybe an apology. Maybe some sign that I still mattered. But that morning, for the first time, I left my phone buried inside my purse the entire service. Pastor Reynolds spoke about grief that day. Not death exactly, but the grief that comes from losing relationships while the people are still alive. I remember sitting there completely still while his words settled into my chest like stones. "Some people," he said gently, "will only value your presence after they experience your absence." I do not know why that sentence affected me so deeply, but I felt tears burn my eyes immediately. After church, a few women invited me to lunch at a small diner downtown. Normally I would have made excuses because Sundays used to belong to Daniel and the kids. But suddenly I realized nobody was expecting me anywhere anymore. So I said yes. We spent nearly 2 hours drinking coffee and talking about ordinary things. Gardening. Arthritis. Rising grocery prices. One woman showed pictures from her trip to Arizona. Another complained about her husband buying another fishing boat he did not need. And somewhere in the middle of all that simple conversation, I noticed something strange. I laughed. A real laugh. Not forced. Not polite. Genuine laughter that startled even me. That evening, I walked through my quiet house differently than before. Instead of feeling abandoned, I started noticing how exhausted I actually was. For years I had lived like an emergency contact for Daniel's entire family. Last-minute babysitting. Loaning money when they overspent. Canceling my own plans whenever they suddenly needed help. And somehow, despite all of it, I still became the problem. Around 8 o'clock that night, I opened one of my kitchen drawers searching for batteries and found an old envelope with Daniel's handwriting on it. Inside was a birthday card he gave me nearly 10 years earlier. "Thank you for always saving me," he had written. "I do not know what I would do without you." I stared at that sentence for a very long time before quietly placing the card back inside the drawer. Then I did something small that felt enormous. I turned my phone completely off and left it there overnight. No waiting. No checking. No hoping. And for the first time since my son cut me out of his life, the silence inside my house no longer felt quite as lonely. By November, the trees outside my house were nearly bare. And for the first time in years, I started noticing how peaceful my mornings could actually be. I began taking slow walks through the neighborhood after breakfast instead of sitting by the window waiting for my phone to ring. There was a small park about half a mile from my house with a walking trail around a pond, and every morning I saw the same older gentleman feeding ducks in a faded Cleveland Browns jacket. One day he smiled at me and said, "You look lighter lately." I almost laughed at how strange that sounded considering the past few months had been some of the most painful of my life. But later that afternoon I realized he was right. I had spent so much energy trying to hold on to people who were pushing me away that I forgot what it felt like to simply exist without fear. Around that same time I started going through old paperwork in my home office. First it was just practical things. bills, insurance forms, mortgage statements. But then I opened a drawer full of old loan documents and found something that made my stomach drop. 3 years earlier, Daniel had asked me to co-sign part of a refinancing agreement on their home because his credit score had temporarily dropped after changing jobs. Just for a little while, he promised back then. It is only paperwork, Mom. I trusted him completely, so I signed without hesitation. But now, staring at those documents again, I realized my name was still attached to a portion of their loan. I spent the next hour reading every page carefully while a cold uneasiness settled over me. If Daniel and Ashley stopped making payments, part of that financial responsibility could fall directly onto me. Suddenly dozens of little memories started clicking together in ways I had ignored before. The expensive Disney vacations they somehow afforded, Ashley constantly redecorating rooms, the brand new SUV sitting in their driveway last Christmas. Meanwhile, Daniel had borrowed money from me at least 4 separate times over the past 2 years. Just until payday, he always said. Most of it was never paid back. That evening I sat quietly at my dining room table while rain tapped against the windows and something uncomfortable finally became impossible to deny. They had no problem needing me financially. They only had a problem needing me emotionally. The realization hurt more than I expected. Around 9 o'clock my phone buzzed suddenly beside me. My heart jumped before I could stop it. But it was not Daniel. It was my bank notifying me about unusual activity connected to the refinancing account. I immediately called the customer service number listed in the email, and after 20 minutes on hold, a representative explained that a payment had recently been missed on the mortgage tied to my name. I sat there frozen, gripping the phone while one terrifying thought echoed through my mind over and over again. My son may have blocked me from his life, but somehow he had still managed to keep me trapped inside his problems. The next morning I drove to the bank in person because I could not stop thinking about that missed mortgage payment. The branch sat in a small shopping plaza beside a dry cleaner and a pet supply store, and I remember staring at the automatic doors for nearly a full minute before walking inside. I had always trusted Daniel completely with money matters. Even after everything that happened between us, part of me still believed there had to be some explanation. Maybe an oversight. Maybe a banking error. But deep down, another part of me already knew the truth was not going to feel comforting. A young banker named Melissa led me into a small office with gray carpet and artificial plants in the corners. She pulled up the refinancing account on her computer, while I sat there gripping my purse tightly in my lap. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said carefully after a few minutes, "there have actually been multiple late payments over the past year." I felt my stomach drop. Multiple. She nodded gently and turned the monitor slightly so I could see the account history. There it was in black and white. Missed payments. Overdraft warnings. Increasing balances on linked credit accounts. I stared at the screen while heat rushed into my face. Daniel had never mentioned any of this. Not once. Am I financially responsible if they stop paying completely? I asked quietly. Melissa hesitated for half a second before answering. Legally, yes. Your name is still attached to part of the agreement. I thanked her politely and somehow managed to walk back to my car without falling apart. But the second I closed the driver's side door, I burst into tears. Not because of the money. I could survive financially if I had to. What shattered me was realizing my son had cut me out emotionally, while still depending on me behind the scenes like some invisible safety net. I sat there in the parking lot remembering all the times Ashley talked about healthy boundaries, while they quietly kept my name attached to their financial problems. Suddenly her behavior made horrifying sense. They did not want closeness. They wanted access. That evening, I called an attorney recommended by one of the women from church. His name was Richard Coleman, and after reviewing my paperwork, he gave me advice that changed everything. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said calmly over the phone, "you need to protect yourself immediately. Because right now your son's financial future is tied directly to yours." I barely slept that night. Around 3 in the morning, I walked downstairs and stood in my dark kitchen listening to the hum of the refrigerator while one painful realization settled heavily over me. For years I had mistaken being needed for being loved. But those two things are not always the same. Sometimes people only keep you close because you are useful to them. And once they believe they no longer need your heart, they still expect access to your sacrifice. The following week, I made the hardest decision I had faced in years. I stopped protecting Daniel from the consequences of his own choices. Richard helped me begin the legal process of removing myself from the refinancing agreement, and although everything was handled professionally, I still felt physically sick signing those documents. Part of me kept hearing the voice of the little boy I raised asking if I would always be there for him. But another part of me finally understood something important. Being a good mother did not mean allowing myself to be destroyed quietly in the background of someone else's life. A few days later, I drove to a small salon downtown and cut my hair shorter than I had worn it in nearly 20 years. It sounds ridiculous now, but sitting in that chair watching several inches of silver blonde hair fall to the floor felt strangely emotional, like I was shedding an old version of myself piece by piece. "You have beautiful cheekbones," the stylist said while turning my chair toward the mirror afterward. I almost did not recognize the woman staring back at me. She looked tired, yes, but lighter somehow, less afraid. Afterward, I bought myself a warm camel-colored coat from a boutique nearby, instead of automatically talking myself out of spending money the way I always had. For years, every extra dollar went toward Daniel or the grandchildren, college funds, emergency loans, birthday gifts, school clothes. I could not remember the last time I purchased something simply because I liked it. Slowly, my days started changing shape. I joined a Wednesday evening book club at church. I started taking weekend drives through nearby lake towns just to explore places I had never bothered seeing before. One Saturday morning, I sat alone in a cafe near Lake Erie drinking cinnamon coffee while snow flurries drifted softly outside the windows, and I realized something shocking. Peace feels unfamiliar when you have spent years living inside emotional tension. Around that same time, Daniel still never called. Not once. At first that hurt terribly. But then another realization slowly took its place. If someone can go months without checking whether you are alive, safe, or hurting, then the relationship was already broken long before the silence began. One evening in early December, I received a voicemail from an unknown number. For a split second my heart raced thinking it might finally be Daniel, but it was actually a realtor returning my inquiry about selling my house. I stood in my kitchen listening to that message twice before looking around the home I had spent nearly 30 years maintaining for everyone except myself. The empty dining room where I hosted every Thanksgiving. The staircase where I used to wait for Daniel to come home after football games. The guest room filled with old toys and blankets for grandchildren who no longer visited. And suddenly I understood something clearly. I was keeping this giant house alive for memories that nobody else seemed to value anymore. So that night, sitting alone beside my Christmas tree, I quietly made another decision that would change all of our lives. I was going to stop building my future around people who had already removed me from theirs. By January, my house was officially on the market. The realtor staged the living room with soft cream blankets and decorative candles, removing all the personal touches that once made it feel like home. Family photos disappeared from shelves. Drawings from my grandchildren were packed into storage bins in the garage. Watching strangers walk through the rooms where I had raised my son felt surreal, but not nearly as painful as I expected. In fact, with every box I packed, I felt strangely calmer. Like I was finally letting go of a version of my life that had already ended months ago. Then one snowy Tuesday morning, my phone rang unexpectedly, while I was wrapping dishes in newspaper. I glanced at the screen and froze. Daniel. For a second, my heart reacted exactly the way it always had. Immediate hope. Immediate panic. Immediate love. I stood there staring at his name until the call nearly went to voicemail before finally answering softly. Hello. There was a pause on the other end before he spoke. Mom. His voice sounded tired. Not emotional. Just stressed. I waited for him to say he was sorry. I waited for him to ask how I was doing after months of silence. Instead, the first thing he asked was, "Did you remove yourself from the mortgage agreement?" I closed my eyes slowly, not because I was surprised anymore, but because some tiny foolish part of me had still hoped this call meant something else. Yes, I answered quietly. Another silence. Then I heard him exhale sharply. Mom, why would you do that without talking to us first? Always us. Never me. I looked around the half-empty kitchen while snow drifted softly outside the windows. You stopped talking to me months ago, Daniel. That is not the point, he snapped, frustration creeping into his voice. The bank is reevaluating everything now. Ashley is freaking out. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. My son could go months without checking if I was lonely, sick, or alive. But the moment his financial stability felt threatened, suddenly I existed again. I needed to protect myself, I said calmly. Protect yourself from your own family, he replied bitterly. That sentence hit me harder than he probably intended, because suddenly I realized something devastating. They still considered me family when they needed something from me, just not when it came to love, respect, or inclusion. I leaned against the kitchen counter and spoke more honestly than I had in years. Daniel, you and Ashley made it very clear I was no longer part of your lives. You do not get to cut someone out emotionally while keeping access to their safety net. The line went completely silent after that. Then finally, in a colder voice I barely recognized anymore, he muttered, I cannot deal with this right now. And just like that, he hung up again. But this time, after staring at my silent phone for several seconds, I noticed something unexpected. I did not cry, because for the first time I finally understood the difference between being missed and being useful. 3 weeks later, my house sold faster than anyone expected. A retired couple from Columbus made an offer 2 days after the listing went live, and by the end of February, nearly everything I owned had been packed into boxes stacked across the living room floor. The night before movers arrived, I walked slowly from room to room one last time. The house echoed now without furniture. Empty walls, bare floors, quiet corners filled with ghosts of ordinary family moments that once felt permanent. I paused in the kitchen where Daniel used to sit at the counter doing homework, while I cooked dinner after long shifts at the nursing home. Then I stood in the doorway of the dining room where every Thanksgiving table had once been crowded with laughter and noisy conversation. It amazed me how quickly a place could stop feeling like home once the people inside it stopped loving each other properly. The condo I bought sat near Lake Erie, about 2 hours away from my old neighborhood. Smaller, simpler, peaceful. The building had large windows overlooking the water, and on clear mornings, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors in a way that made the entire place feel calm. For the first time in decades, every inch of my home belonged only to me. No guest room waiting for people who rarely came. No giant dining table prepared for holidays that ended in disappointment. Just quiet. Honest quiet. A few days after I moved in, I was unpacking dishes when someone knocked unexpectedly on my front door. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it without thinking. Then my breath caught instantly. Daniel stood there holding his coat tightly against the cold wind blowing off the lake. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. There were dark circles under his eyes I had never noticed before. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways over the past few months. I thought maybe I would cry. Maybe I would hug him. Maybe I would finally scream all the things I swallowed for years. But instead, I just stood there strangely calm. His eyes moved slowly past me into the condo behind me. I could tell immediately he was surprised. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen counter. Music played softly somewhere in the background. There were framed photographs of sunsets instead of old family portraits covering every wall. You moved, he said quietly, almost like he still could not believe it. Yes, I answered simply. Another silence stretched between us before he finally spoke again. You never told me. I almost laughed at that. Months earlier, he had erased me from his life so completely that he never even noticed I was selling the family home. But now suddenly my absence felt real to him for the first time. He looked back at me carefully, and I realized something important in that moment. My son had expected to find the same grieving woman he left behind months ago. The lonely mother waiting by the phone. The emotional safety net he could return to whenever life became difficult. Instead, he found someone he no longer fully recognized. And for the first time since all of this began, I could see uncertainty in his eyes instead of mine. Daniel stood awkwardly near the doorway while cold March wind swept through the hallway behind him. For a moment, he looked less like the confident grown man who had cut me out of his life, and more like the nervous teenager who used to come home after making mistakes at school. But this time I did not rush to make things easier for him. I stepped aside politely and said, "You can come in for a few minutes." He walked slowly into the condo, glancing around again while I closed the door behind him. I noticed how carefully he studied everything. The fresh flowers by the window, the neatly stacked books on my coffee table, the watercolor painting hanging near the kitchen. This was not the house he remembered. This version of my life had no space designed around waiting for him anymore. "It is nice here," he said quietly. "Thank you," I answered. I offered him coffee out of habit, and for a second I almost hated myself for it. Mothers spend years loving automatically even after being wounded. He sat at the small kitchen table while I poured 2 cups. The silence between us felt heavy but strangely calm. Finally he rubbed his forehead and sighed deeply. "Things have been rough lately," he admitted. I sat across from him without speaking. "The company downsized after Christmas," he continued. "I lost my management position in January." I nodded slowly, waiting. "Ashley is working extra shifts now, but daycare costs are killing us. And with the mortgage situation changing." His voice trailed off. There it was. The real reason he came. Not guilt. Not love. Need. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup carefully before answering. "I am sorry things have been difficult." He looked at me then with frustration mixed into exhaustion. "That is it?" he asked quietly. "Mom, we are drowning right now." "We." Always we. The same word used when shutting me out. The same word used when they decided I no longer belonged in their lives. I studied my son's face for a long moment before speaking gently. "Daniel, when you blocked my number, you made a very clear decision about our relationship." He looked down immediately. Ashley thought some distance would help things calm down. I almost smiled sadly at that. Even now, he still could not fully take responsibility for his own choices. "Distance," I repeated softly. "You erased me from your family, Daniel." The room fell silent again except for the faint sound of waves outside the windows. Then finally, in a quieter voice, he said something I never expected to hear from him. "I do not think Ashley realized how much we depended on you." The honesty of that sentence landed harder than any apology could have. Because after all these months, my son had finally admitted the truth out loud. I had not been cherished. I had been relied on. There is a painful difference between those two things. Daniel looked up at me again, and for the first time in years, I saw uncertainty in his expression instead of entitlement. "Mom," he said carefully, "I do not know how to fix any of this." I held his gaze calmly before answering with more peace than anger. "That is because relationships are not emergencies you only care about once something starts collapsing." After Daniel left that afternoon, I stood by the window for a long time watching gray waves roll across Lake Erie beneath the cloudy spring sky. His car remained parked outside for several minutes before finally pulling away slowly down the street. And strangely enough, instead of feeling devastated the way I once would have, I felt calm. Not triumphant. Not bitter. Just calm. Because somewhere along the way, I had stopped measuring my worth by how desperately other people needed me. A week later, Daniel called again. This time I answered without fear twisting inside my chest. His voice sounded softer than before. More careful. "Mom," he said quietly, "the kids miss you." That sentence hurt in ways I could not fully explain. Not because I doubted it, but because children should never become emotional bridges between adults who failed each other. "I miss them too," I answered honestly. There was silence for a moment before he continued. "Ashley and I have been talking. We know things got out of hand." I leaned back in my chair near the balcony doors while warm sunlight spilled across the floor. Months earlier, those words would have felt like victory. Now they just felt sad. "Daniel," I said gently, "families do not fall apart all at once. It happens slowly, usually through repeated moments where people choose convenience over care." He exhaled quietly on the other end of the line. "I know I hurt you." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then finally, I said the truth I had carried inside me for months. What hurt most was not being blocked. It was realizing how easy it became for you to live without me. His voice cracked slightly when he answered. "It was not easy." Maybe that was true. But pain does not disappear simply because someone regrets causing it later. Over the following weeks, things changed carefully between us. Not magically. Not perfectly. Daniel started calling every Sunday afternoon. Sometimes the children joined the calls and told me stories about school or soccer practice. Once, Mason proudly showed me a missing front tooth over video chat, while Emma asked if my new condo had seagulls outside the windows. Ashley remained distant at first, but eventually she appeared briefly during one call and quietly thanked me for sending the children Easter baskets. It was awkward, polite, fragile, but real. And for the first time in a very long while, nobody was pretending anymore. One evening in early May, I sat alone on my balcony wrapped in a light sweater while the sunset painted the lake gold and orange. I thought about the woman I had been a year earlier, the lonely mother waiting beside a silent phone, believing love meant sacrificing herself endlessly for people who barely noticed the cost. I still loved my son deeply. That never disappeared. But now I understood something I wish more mothers were taught before giving away entire pieces of themselves. Love should never require you to abandon your own dignity, just to remain included in someone else's life. Sometimes the most painful betrayals teach you the most necessary lesson of all. If people truly value your presence, they will not wait until your absence becomes inconvenient to finally show it.